So now it's time to connect to our database. So the first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to open up my project, and then in the connection, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to remove this echo. We don't need this echo. And then here we need to get the credentials that would allow us to connect to the database. Let me first of all create variables for these credentials. So first of all, I'm going to create a variable called db for database underscore name, which is going to be the database name. And then we also need the MySQL username. So I'm going to say MySQL username. And then we also need the MySQL password. So I'm going to say MySQL pass or password. And finally, we need the server name. So I'm going to say here $, and then server name. So where should we get these credentials from? Well, as I told you earlier, we can get these credentials from the database. So you need to open up your PHP My Admin, and then if you head on over to your PHP My Admin and then click on user accounts, you'll find many accounts. And as I told you earlier, the account that we are interested in is the root, because it's easier to connect to the root. There are nothing is special about this root. Alternatively, you can use the last one, which has a host name of localhost. But I'm going to be using this one. I'm going to be using the root 127.0.0.1. So the username is root. Let me type that in my connection.php. The username here should be root. Now, what about the host name? The host name is 127.0.0.1. So the host name here, the server name is going to be 127.0.0.1. And finally, we need the password. The password is nothing. And since the password is nothing, just leave it empty. Just leave this empty. This means that there is no password. Finally, we need the database name. Remember, the database that I have created called the database that I have created is called movies underscore API. This is the database name, movies underscore API. So in my application, I'm going to here type in the database name. I'm going to type movies underscore API. And if you misspell any of these credentials, any of these variables, you aren't going to be able to connect to the database. So you need to double check the spelling of all of these variables. Make sure that they are correct. So this is the first step, which is getting, let's say, getting database variables or credentials. Database credentials. Now it's time to connect to the database. Given that we have these variables, it's time to connect to the database. How can we tell our connection.php, hey, connection.php, please, we want you to connect to the database? Well, it's very, very simple. All you need to do is that you need to use a function called mysqli underscore connect. This function is gonna let you connect to the database. And this function takes 4 parameters. The first parameter that it takes is the server name. The second parameter is the username, is the MySQL username. And the third parameter is the password, MySQL password. And the last parameter is the database name. So here, comma, and then database name. That's it. But after executing this function, we need to make sure whether we connected to the database or not. Therefore, I'm gonna store this in a variable called con, which is gonna be equal to MySQLi. Some people like to name it connection, but I'm gonna just name it con for short. Connection, or connect here, connect to database. And now, since we have this variable, this function is gonna return true or false. So if we can use that, we can use this con to use if statement. So here I'm gonna say if the connection, if connection is false, false exclamation, which means false. If there is no connection, if we cannot connect to the database, let me here add a comment. If we can't connect, then we can display error message, or we can simply use the die function. Some developers like to use the die function. You can use here the die. Other developers like to use the echo. I like to use the echo because it's better in my opinion. I'm gonna here echo a message. Here I'm gonna echo a message in a JSON format, because later I'm gonna showing you the power of using JSON. So here I'm gonna echo a message, a key called message, and the value is gonna be the value itself, which can be unable to connect to database. And finally, I'm gonna add here semicolon, and you don't need to do anything further. But for now, just for now, I'm gonna use else, and then I'm gonna say here echo, and then I'm gonna say connected successfully, and then semicolon. But later you shouldn't be using echo here. Once you have connected to the database, there is no need to do anything else. It's done. Once you have connected, it's okay. But if there is a problem, you need to use this echo. So once you are done, let me here. I'm gonna also here say die in order to stop and not continue. I'm gonna use here also the die function, just to make sure that the code, that whenever we have a code that below it will never be executed, we just need to stop whenever we cannot connect to the database for some reason. So now let me save and head on over to the browser. And now in the browser, if we execute the connection one more time, let me here hit enter. As you can see here, it's gonna say connected successfully because our credentials are correct. Let me intentionally change here the credentials. For example, let me here type a wrong credentials. Let me here type a wrong server name. If you type here a wrong server name, for example, and then click on file save, and then if you attempt to connect to the database, if you click on refresh to try to one more time to connect to the database, it's gonna say here no route to host, and then here it says message unable to connect to database. And if you try, for example, if you try to type a wrong, instead of wrong server, if you try to type a wrong username, let me type nothing for the username, and let me here click on save. And if I try to connect to the database here, let me try one more time. It's gonna also print here out some errors. It says here access denied for user for user at localhost to database movies in line 10. Because you cannot connect to the database that way because you have an error. Finally, I'm gonna be using the error reporting. The error reporting is also imported at the top of the script. I'm gonna say here error reporting, and then I'm gonna say 0. This error reporting is gonna stop reporting the errors and only use the errors, the custom errors that I have. If you type here, if you change this to 0, it's very important to have here descriptive or meaningful messages. If you don't have here meaningful messages, you shouldn't be using this line of code. Let me show you what's going to happen if you use this line of code. If now you refresh, it's going to turn off the error messages that come with PHP. It's only going to use the error messages that I have created. But if you remove this error reporting, it's going to use the custom, it's going to use the errors that come with PHP. Here, as you can see, it's going to be using the errors that come with PHP. So this is all you need to know about connecting to the database in order to be able to interact with the database.